30 feet beneath St. Peter's Basilica, there is a Roman street almost no visitor is allowed to enter. It runs underground for more than 50 meters. Family mausoleums line both sides. Frescoes still hold their color on the walls. Mosaics still cover the floors. The world inside was sealed from ordinary daylight and circulation in the 4th century, and survived because it remained buried. The street climbs gently beneath the basilica. It does not lead to an exit. It leads to a wall. And directly behind that wall, beneath the most important altar in the Catholic world, sits a simple grave. For nearly 2,000 years, the surface of the Vatican has been built, rebuilt, and photographed by millions. But since its excavation, the path beneath it has remained under controlled access. What lies down there is not a single secret. It is a buried Roman city, a grave that should not have existed, a wall covered in scratched names, and a box of human bones quietly returned to the place they came from. And much of it remains outside ordinary public view. The Vatican is not one building. It is a vertical structure of memory, a modern basilica above a 4th century basilica, a 4th century basilica above a Roman cemetery above a hill that once stood outside the walls of the empire. Most visitors only ever see the top layer. What survives beneath the floor is older, stranger, and more carefully guarded than the surface ever suggests. To understand why, you have to begin where the modern world is not free to wander. You have to begin under the altar. Chapter 1. The Street Under the Altar. In 1939, Pope Pius XI died. His successor, Pius XII, ordered him buried in the grottos beneath the basilica, near the other popes. The grottos were the lowest level of the church anyone normally entered. Below that was foundation. Below that, no one was quite sure. The workers preparing the new tomb began cutting downward. They expected earth and rubble. They hit a painted Roman wall. What happened next was kept quiet for years. In the middle of the Second World War, with the world distracted by far larger events, the Vatican authorized a small team of archaeologists to begin excavating beneath the basilica. They worked under bare bulbs. They worked under armed silence. They cut downward, then sideways, with hand tools, through ground that had not been disturbed for nearly 17 centuries. And what they found was not a tomb. It was a street. A complete Roman street, lined on both sides with family mausoleums, sloping gently upward toward the spot directly beneath the high altar of the basilica. This is what makes the site beneath the Vatican so unusual. It is not a ruin exposed to weather. It is not a field of foundations and broken columns. It is a sealed neighborhood, removed from time at the moment Constantine ordered it filled in. The mausoleums still stand to their original height. They have ceilings. They have doors. Many still carry their original plaster. The painted figures on the walls have faded, but they have not vanished. The family names of the people buried here remain legible above the entrances, carved in clean Roman lettering by craftsmen who had no idea what would one day be built on top of their work. Inside one tomb, a mosaic on the ceiling shows a charioteer driving a team of horses. Inside another, the floor preserves a geometric pattern of black and white tesserae, laid down with the precision of a workshop that expected the design to last a few generations. It lasted longer than that. The doors of these mausoleums were sealed for the same reason the rest of the Roman cemetery was sealed. When Constantine ordered his basilica built on this slope in the early 4th century, the only way to make the ground level was to bury the cemetery in place. The roofs of most tombs were broken off. The interiors were packed with earth. The street was covered, layer by layer, in soil and concrete until the surface above could carry the weight of a vast Christian building. For almost 17 centuries, no one walked it. The air did not circulate, the light did not enter. The frescoes waited in the dark. And then, beneath the working basilica, a few archaeologists with hand tools opened the first sealed door. They stepped into a piece of Rome that had been removed from history. But the street was not the answer. It was the path. Because the excavators were not moving at random. They were following the slope upward, toward one specific point on the hill. Toward the spot directly beneath the high altar. Toward whatever it was that Constantine had refused to move away from. Chapter 2. The hill Rome tried to forget. To understand why a Roman street ended up sealed beneath the Vatican, you have to leave the basilica entirely. You have to go back to a hill that, in the first century, was not the center of anything. It was the edge. The Vatican Hill stood on the wrong side of the Tiber, outside the walls of ancient Rome. Marshy ground. A circus built by Caligula and later used by Nero. A road lined with tombs, because Roman law forbade burial inside the city itself. The hill belongs to the dead. The obelisk now standing at the center of St. Peter's Square is part of that older world. It once rose on the spine of Nero's circus. It is the only object on the surface today that was already there when this ground was still considered marginal land. According to Christian tradition, it was in or near that circus, around the year 64, that a wave of executions followed the Great Fire of Rome. Among those condemned, the tradition holds, was a Galilean fisherman. His name was Peter. Roman records do not confirm it. No tomb is listed in any official register. By the empire's own accounting, nothing of importance happened on that hill. And yet, within a few generations, something strange begins to take shape there. People come back, not in crowds, in small groups, quietly. They scratch graffiti into the walls of nearby tombs. They write a single name in Greek letters, again and again. Petros. For 2 centuries, the empire is still hostile and Christianity is still illegal. But the pattern holds. The same hill, the same patch of ground, the same name. Something on that slope was being remembered. Then, in 312, everything changes. Constantine becomes emperor. Christianity becomes tolerated and then favored. And almost immediately, Constantine makes a decision that defies the basic logic of Roman engineering. He orders a basilica built precisely on the Vatican Hill. The site is difficult. The ground slopes sharply. A working Roman cemetery has to be partially destroyed and partially buried to make the foundations level. Tons of soil and concrete have to be dragged uphill to create an artificial platform. There is flatter, easier ground a short distance away. Constantine refuses to move. He insists against every practical argument that the church must be built here, on this slope, above this exact patch of ground. Once you understand what early Christians had been visiting on that hill for 2 centuries, the decision stops looking like architecture. It starts looking like confirmation, because Constantine was not choosing a site. He was sealing one. Chapter 3. The grave under the high altar. The Roman street beneath the basilica narrows as it climbs. The family mausoleums end. The wealthier tombs give way to something simpler. Smaller burials, poorer ones. The kind that belonged to people who were not part of Rome's official world. And then, at the highest point under the altar, the excavation reached a wall. It was older than the basilica above it, but newer than the cemetery around it. a modest stone wall built into the ground sometime in the 2nd century. Plain, undecorated, nothing about it announced itself. In front of it, in the open earth, was a simple grave. No sarcophagus, no marble, no inscription announcing a name. Just a shape in the ground, framed by the wall, positioned almost directly under the spot the basilica had been built to mark. To understand what the archaeologists were seeing, it helps to picture the geometry. The basilica above had been rebuilt in the 16th century, replacing Constantine's original 4th century church. The high altar in the modern basilica had been placed above the high altar of the old basilica, which had been placed above this exact wall, which had been built around this exact grave. Every layer was lined up. Every architect, century after century, had treated this point on the ground as a fixed reference, even when nothing on the surface explained why. The wall itself was covered in writing. Hundreds of small scratches, names, prayers, initials, the kind of graffiti left by visitors over many generations. And on one panel, scratched into the plaster by an unknown hand, 3 Greek letters appeared together. Petros eni. The phrase is commonly read as, "Peter is here." Other readings have been proposed by scholars over the years. The inscription is small. The letters are not all clear, but the most accepted interpretation is also the most direct. A name, a location, a statement. The excavators did not announce the find immediately. For years, the discovery was studied, debated, and re-examined. The church was cautious. The world was cautious. To claim that the grave of Peter had been identified beneath the Vatican was to anchor the foundation of an entire institution on a single piece of physical evidence buried for nearly 2,000 years. In 1950, Pius XII finally spoke publicly. He stated that the tomb of St. Peter had been identified beneath the basilica. He stopped short of confirming what had been inside it, because the grave was empty. The bones that should have been there were not there. After more than a decade of excavation, after the discovery of a buried Roman street, after the careful approach toward the wall, the place itself contained nothing. That should have ended the search. It was the beginning of a different one. Chapter 4: The Bones in the Wall. Years passed. The excavation moved on. A small number of visitors began to be allowed down into the necropolis under tightly controlled conditions. But one scholar working on the site refused to accept that the grave had truly been empty. Her name was Margherita Guarducci, an Italian epigrapher, a specialist in ancient inscriptions, including the kind scratched into walls by people who could not afford monuments. She returned to the wall. She studied the graffiti. She traced the structures around the tomb. She read every fragment of documentation left behind by the earlier excavators, and she began to notice something odd. One of the workmen, years before, had quietly removed material from a hollow inside the wall. He had stored it in a wooden box. He had placed the box in a storeroom. And then, for reasons that were never fully explained, the box had been forgotten. When Guarducci tracked it down and opened it, she found bones, human bones, wrapped in fragments of fabric. The fabric included traces interpreted as purple and gold thread, the kind of material used in the ancient world for remains considered important. The bones belonged to a single individual. A man, robust, estimated between 60 and 70 years old at death. The body was largely present except for the feet, which were missing entirely. That last detail became the most discussed. According to the oldest Christian tradition, Peter was crucified upside down in Nero's circus. Some scholars have argued that one method documented in Roman executions for removing a body from such a cross was to cut it free at the ankles. Whether the absence of feet in this skeleton reflects that, or simply the conditions of an ancient burial, has been debated ever since. It is an interpretation, not a proof. What Guarducci had assembled was not a forensic identification in the modern sense. No analysis at that time could prove the identity of remains nearly 2,000 years old. What she had was a convergence. The age of the man, his build, the wrapping, the position of the bones in the wall's position in the grave's position beneath the altar's position beneath the basilica. The graffiti scratched around all of it. Every layer pointed inward, toward the same point. In 1968, Pope Paul VI made a public statement. The relics of St. Peter, he said, had been identified in a manner that could be considered convincing. He did not say definitive. He did not say proven. He chose his words like a man placing them on fragile ground. The bones were returned to the wall, sealed inside small transparent containers in the original niche. They are still there. The Vatican described the evidence as convincing. It has never described it as final. That distinction matters, because the grave beneath St. Peter's is not presented as a forensic case. It is presented as a convergence of tradition, location, archaeology, and belief. Only layers of stone and centuries of construction separate the most visited church in the world from the grave that tradition has spent 2,000 years marking. Chapter 5. Why most visitors are not allowed in the site beneath St. Peter's has a name. It is called the Scavi. The excavations. Access remains tightly controlled. You cannot simply walk in. Advance booking is mandatory, and daily availability is limited. Every visit follows an authorized guide in small groups of no more than 12 people. Photography and video recording are not permitted. Young children are not admitted, and the conditions below ground are carefully controlled to protect the ancient structures. The air down there is held at a managed humidity. Light levels are kept low. Every visitor passes through several thresholds where temperature and moisture are adjusted because the ancient plaster is fragile, and a single uncontrolled shift could begin to lift pigment off the walls. The tour follows a fixed path. You see part of the Roman street. You see several of the mausoleums. You see the wall covered in graffiti. You see the area directly beneath the high altar. You do not see everything. Many areas of the necropolis are not part of the public route. Some mausoleums have only been opened for research purposes. Other passages have been mapped but are not normally available to visitors. Much of the site remains outside ordinary public access. The reasons given are practical. The pigments are unstable. The plaster is centuries beyond what conservation guidelines normally accept. The mosaics survived only because they were sealed. Opening the wrong door, in the wrong way, on the wrong day, could undo work that no future restoration can recover. These reasons are real, but they coexist with something older. For most of its history, the church has not treated this site as a museum. It has treated it as a relic, showing too much risks reducing it. Confirming too much risks, closing questions that the institution has historically preferred to leave partially open. Sealing it entirely risks losing the very thing the building above is built to mark. So the necropolis is held in a careful balance. Open enough to study, closed enough to protect, visible enough to confirm the story, hidden enough to keep its weight. Some places remain powerful precisely because they are not fully converted into content. The Scavi is one of them. What sits beneath St. Peter's is not a museum exhibit. It is a working part of a living institution. And the institution has its own reasons for keeping much of it outside ordinary public access. Chapter 6. The Archive Above the Underground. The Vatican preserves more than stone. A few hundred meters from the Basilica, behind walls that no ordinary tourist will pass, sits the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Until 2019, it was known by another name, the Secret Archive. The word secretum in Latin did not originally mean hidden, it meant private, personal to the Pope. But the older name carried a weight the institution eventually decided to soften. The archive holds, by its own published estimate, more than 80 kilometers of shelving. Documents going back more than 12 centuries. Letters from emperors. Trial records. Correspondence with kings. The original transcripts of the Galileo case. Records concerning the Knights Templar. Diplomatic exchanges that helped shape European borders. A portion of this material, the older and less sensitive records, can be consulted by qualified researchers under strict conditions. Material from the last several decades remains closed. This is not unusual. Most countries hold their historical records under restricted access. What makes the Vatican Archive different is its age, its scope, and the fact that it documents the internal decisions of an institution that has shaped much of European history without ever being a conventional state. There are documents in those shelves that have rarely been consulted, even by specialists. What lies inside is unlikely to be explosive in the way conspiracy stories imagine, but it is, by design, not yours. And that is the pattern. The Scavi preserves stone beneath the Basilica. The archive preserves paper beside it. Both are visible only in carefully managed portions. Both are protected behind credentials, applications, and time. Both depend on the same underlying principle, that some things are stronger when they remain partly out of view. The Vatican does not only preserve relics, it preserves controlled access to memory. Chapter 7. The Vatican as a Vertical Archive. It would be easy to treat all of this as theatrics. A buried Roman street, a grave beneath an altar, a wall of scratched names, bones in a box, an archive of locked rooms. But the deeper meaning of the Vatican is not in any single discovery. It is in the logic that connects them. Each visible layer of the Vatican is responding to a layer beneath it. The Vatican Hill was used as a burial ground because Rome placed its dead outside the walls. The Roman cemetery developed there because the hill was already considered marginal land. The early Christian graffiti accumulated there because someone the community refused to forget was buried in that cemetery. The grave beneath the altar exists because the cemetery was in use when he was placed in it. Constantine's Basilica exists because the grave existed. The modern Basilica, rebuilt in the 16th century, exists because Constantine's Basilica existed. The Scavi exists because the modern Basilica had to be repaired. The Apostolic Archive exists because an institution this old generates more documentation than any single library can ever fully open. Each layer rests on the one below it. Pull out the bottom and the whole structure becomes a story without a foundation. The Vatican is not one building. It is a vertical archive. Stone, memory, and authority stacked above a single point in the ground. A point whose identity has been debated, defended, excavated, sealed, and partially revealed across nearly 2,000 years. That point may or may not contain the man tradition assigns to it. The physical evidence does not close the question. It keeps it positioned. But the certainty was never the real engine. The continuity was. For nearly 2,000 years, in one place, on one hill, the same patch of ground has been visited, marked, buried, rebuilt, sealed, excavated, and protected. Through Roman emperors, through barbarian invasions, through medieval upheaval, through the Reformation, through 2 world wars. Few places on Earth carry that kind of unbroken attention, and almost none of them keep so much of themselves out of view. Stand in St. Peter's Square at the end of a long day. The light flattens, the crowds thin, the colonnade closes in around the open space. The dome behind it remains lit, calm, monumental, almost too perfect to be real. Most of the people who see it will never know what is underneath them. A Roman necropolis, a street that has not seen direct sunlight since the 4th century. Frescoes locked in their plaster, mosaics on floors no ordinary tour walks, a wall covered in 2,000 years of scratched names, a simple grave in front of it, a small container of bones in a niche, returned to where they were found. Above that, an archive behind closed doors, holding decisions that helped shape continents, rooms that no tour reaches, documents that few researchers have read, and above all of it, a basilica built in a place where, by every rule of Roman engineering, it should not have been built. Held in position, century after century, by a point in the ground the church has refused to fully open and refused to fully close. The Vatican is not hiding one simple secret. It is a structure that survives because it does not show everything. A church built on a convergence of tradition, location, archaeology, and belief. And after 2,000 years, the deepest part of the Vatican is not the tomb itself. It is the question still kept beneath the floor.
Yeah!